You just spent 100 years being robbed, humiliated, carved up, and told it was for your own good. And then, just when you finally clawed your way back to your feet, the same people who did it to you looked you in the eye and said, "Let's cooperate, but play by our rules." Would you shake that hand? Would you trust that smile? Hell no. China did try more than once, and every single time, history had something to say about it. So when you look at China today, at the military build-ups, the hardline diplomacy, the refusal to defer to Western institutions, a lot of people call that aggression. But what if it isn't aggression at all? What if it's memory? What if it's a country that learned, the hard way and more than once, exactly what happens when you let your guard down? That's what this story is about. Not headlines, not talking points. The actual history that made China what it is today, and why the distrust runs so deep it might never come out. In the early 1800s, China was the dominant civilization on Earth. The Qing dynasty ruled hundreds of millions of people. Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea were the most coveted goods in the world. China's economy represented roughly a third of total global GDP. They didn't need anyone, and they knew it. Britain had a serious problem. They were hooked on Chinese tea. Millions of pounds imported every single year, paid for in silver, because China wanted nothing Britain had to offer. British silver was draining at a rate that was becoming a national crisis. Britain tried wool, textiles, clocks, manufactured goods. China said no thank you and meant it. They literally said, "Get that shite out of here." So Britain made a calculation that was cold, deliberate, and monstrous. They controlled India. India grew opium, and opium does something wool and clocks cannot do. It makes the customer come back forever, regardless of cost. Britain industrialized production through the East India Company, auctioned it to private merchants, and those merchants smuggled it into China. The British government kept its hands clean. Plausible deniability on an imperial scale. It worked exactly as intended. In 1800, China imported around 4,000 chests of opium annually. By 1838, that number hit 40,000. Each chest weighed 140 pounds. The flow of silver reversed completely. Chinese silver now bled out to pay for the drug destroying the population from within. By the 1830s, roughly 2 million Chinese people were addicted. By mid-century, between 10 and 12 million. Farmers stopped farming. Soldiers couldn't fight. Families collapsed. The most powerful dynasty in Asia was being dismantled from the inside. In 1839, the emperor sent Lin Zexu to Canton with one mission: end the trade completely. Lin tried diplomacy first, writing a letter to Queen Victoria with a simple and devastating argument. You ban opium in your own country because you know what it does to people, so why are you selling it to ours? Queen Victoria never replied. So Lin surrounded the foreign merchant quarter, forced the handover of every stockpile, and destroyed the lot. Over 20,000 chests, more than 1,400 tons dissolved over 23 days. Britain's response was warships. A sovereign nation had enforced its own drug laws, and Britain declared war. The First Opium War lasted from 1840 to 1842 and was never a fair fight. Britain had steam-powered gunboats, modern artillery, and battle-hardened tactics. China had wooden war junk and cannons centuries out of date. Chinese soldiers fought bravely, but courage doesn't stop artillery shells. China signed the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. 21 million silver dollars in reparations, 6 million of which compensated British merchants for the opium Lin had destroyed. China paid for its own drug enforcement being used against it. Hong Kong handed over permanently. 5 ports opened on British terms. British citizens exempt from Chinese law entirely. That is not a trade deal. That is conquest dressed in legal language. Once the world saw China could be beaten, everyone lined up. Russia, Germany, France, Japan. In some foreign-controlled zones inside China, signs read "No dogs" or "Chinese" in their own country. Then in 1856 it happened again. A ship called the Arrow was boarded by Chinese officials. Its British registration had expired, but Britain declared it an insult to the flag. France joined in. The Second Opium War began over paperwork. British and French forces marched to Beijing and found the old Summer Palace, an 860-acre complex built over 150 years, filled with centuries of Chinese civilization. They looted it first. Then Lord Elgin ordered it burned. 3 days it burned, visible from Beijing. The emperor watched his civilization's greatest cultural monument turn to ash and could do nothing. When it was over, China legalized opium, paid more reparations, and surrendered more territory. By 1906, China had 13.5 million registered opium addicts. The country that had been the economic center of the world was now called the sick man of Asia. In 1900, the Boxers rose up against foreign influence. 8 nations invaded, crushed the uprising, and forced China to pay 450 million taels of silver, more than the government's entire annual revenue. China was made to compensate the people exploiting it for the inconvenience of being resisted. The Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911. Warlords and chaos followed. Then Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and launched a full-scale invasion in 1937. The Rape of Nanking saw between 200,000 and 300,000 civilians massacred in 6 weeks. For 8 years, China fought. Millions died. But underneath the horror, something shifted. The Chinese people started to unite. The pressure had been building for a century. By 1949, it found its outlet. Mao Zedong and the Communist Party won the Civil War. On October 1st, 1949, Mao stood in Tiananmen Square and declared the People's Republic of China. 4 words defined the moment. The Chinese people have stood up. Those words land completely differently when you understand what China had been forced to kneel before. This entire period from 1839 to 1949 is what China calls the Century of Humiliation, Bainian Guoqi. It is taught in every school, fills museums, runs through films and political speeches. It is not a footnote. It is the foundation of Chinese national identity and the lens through which every interaction with the outside world is processed. So China stood up, and what did the West do? It tried to push China back down. A full trade embargo was imposed. China was locked out of the United Nations for over 20 years, while Taiwan held their Security Council seat. American military alliances ringed China's borders. The message was clear: you are not our equal, and we intend to keep it that way. Korea reinforced it. In 1950, American-led forces pushed toward the Chinese border. Beijing entered the war. Over 180,000 Chinese soldiers died. Then, Vietnam, another Western military campaign on China's southern border. From Beijing, it looked like the same story twice in 20 years. Contain China. Keep China in its place. Even after Nixon's visit in 1972 and Deng Xiaoping's reforms in the late 1970s, genuine trust never developed. The relationship was profitable, but transactional, built on mutual interest, not mutual respect. Then China transformed. 4 decades of the fastest sustained economic expansion in recorded history. Hundreds of millions lifted from poverty. By 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, and by 2010, the second largest economy on Earth. Here is where everything shifted. The West was comfortable with China as the workshop. When corporations were offshoring manufacturing, nobody raised security concerns. The moment China started building technology companies capable of competing globally, everything changed. Huawei led in telecommunications. TikTok dominated app stores. Chinese electric vehicles outcompeted Western brands. Suddenly, it was national security threats, forced decoupling, and export controls designed to slow Chinese progress. Some of those concerns may be legitimate, but here is what China hears. When you were buying our manufactured goods, free trade was sacred. The moment we started competing at the level that actually matters, you changed the rules. From Beijing, it sounds identical to what Britain did in the 1840s. Free trade is a principle the powerful champion when it benefits them and abandon the moment it stops. So here is where we are. China is the second largest economy on Earth and rising. Military modernization proceeding rapidly. Nuclear weapons, advanced technology, growing global influence. They have risen and they remember everything. When Western leaders invoke the rules-based international order, China hears the order built while we were too weak to have a seat at the table. When they talk about free trade, China hears free until we start winning. When they raise human rights, China hears a tool aimed at governments the West wants to weaken. The Communist Party's legitimacy rests on one promise. We ended the humiliation. We made China strong enough that it cannot happen again. If China backs down under foreign pressure, the story justifying party authority cracks. Taiwan is not simply a territorial dispute. It would feel like another piece carved away by foreign powers. The South China Sea is about ensuring no foreign navy dominates Chinese waters the way the Royal Navy once did. Can trust ever be rebuilt? It is hard to see how. Trust requires vulnerability, and China has learned what vulnerability invites. Trust requires setting the past aside, and China has chosen to keep that past alive as the engine of national identity. Trust requires rules applied consistently, and China has watched those rules bend too many times. This does not make conflict inevitable. Countries without trust can still trade and cooperate on shared challenges, but we are entering an era where the global system will be genuinely contested, where China builds parallel institutions because it does not trust the ones built while it was on its knees, where every interaction carries historical weight that will not dissolve in a summit or a trade deal. The century of humiliation ended in 1949. Its shadow does not. China remembers what it meant to be weak. China remembers what the world did with that weakness, and China has decided it will never give the world that opportunity again. That is not aggression. That is a lesson learned the hardest possible way. And if you want to understand where the next century of global power is headed, that is exactly where you have to start. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to keep watching.